We're going to do some mathematical calculations to explain how specificity is calculated. Now, the specificity can be calculated using the presence of ID, class, and element. Values are given to this in hundreds, tens, and ones respectively. So, if a selector has an ID, one ID represents 100, two IDs represents 200, a class represents 10, two classes 20, and so on, and an element just represents 1 point. So if you have 3 elements, that's 3, 10 elements, that is 10. For classes, if you had 10 classes, that is 100, and if you had 10 IDs, that is 1000. Let's look at this example. Now we have different examples. Even if you don't understand, just have an idea. As we go on, it will be clearer. For a selector that just has H1 is an element, so that is just 1. Then the second example, we have 3 elements, so that is 3. The third example, we have 2 classes, 2 elements, which is 22. Then the fourth example, we have 1 identifier, that is like 100. So just having 1 identifier is greater than all the ones we have seen before that. Then the fifth one, we have 1 identifier and 1 element. So even if some of these selectors look weird, we're going to go to an example to have selectors that you're more familiar with. But note that an identifier has hash in front of it, just in case you're wondering what that is. An identifier is like an ID, and we use it in HTML. It has a hash before the name. Now let's look at this. 2 buttons. We have 2 blue buttons, and if I hover over the second one, you see a double border around it. Let's look at the code. Now, we have a div, an outer div, and it has an ID outer. Then I have an inner div inside that outer div with an ID inner. Inside this inner div, I have an unordered list and 2 list items. And these items contain a link. In this link, we have the text 1, and in the second one, I have 2. Notice that the list items have a class nav. So these are the important items to take into consideration. We're going to go to the CSS and see how the decision was made that these list items were blue. So we're going to go there and check it out. So first things first, let us look at first 2 selectors. These are the selectors that determine the color of the button. Now we have the first one that says background color red, and the second one says background color blue. If you look at the selector, they both address a link at the end, but they address it in different ways. So this is an issue of specificity. How do we determine which one is going to be chosen? Now, the first one says any link inside the outer ID. So on a normal way, that should work because these links are within a div of the outer, even though it's not directly. But the second one says a link inside an inner that is inside an outer. Now, the reason CSS will choose this second one is because it is more specific. It has 2 IDs, whereas the first one just has 1 ID. So the first one is 101, the second one is 201. So 201 is greater than 101. That is why we see that the 2 buttons are blue. So that is how we got to 2 buttons. If I remove this second one, you can see that the 2 buttons become red because now there isn't any other competition and we have just one definition. But once the second one is brought in, is more specific, and then we choose the second one. Let's go over to the next. Now, this determines the color of the text. We have two here, and they address the text in different ways. The first one says a link inside a list, inside an other list, in a div, in an element with an ID outer. So the first one has 4 elements and 1 ID. The second one has 1 ID, 1 class, and 3 elements. So by the time you do the hundreds, tens, and units, the first one is 104 or 104, and the second one is 113. Now the second one is more specific because when you add up the ID, class, and elements, it's heavier or more specific than the earlier one. So CSS will choose this number 4. That is why the text color is white, even though both of them are addressing the same text color of the link. Now let's go over to the border. Now we have 3 that address the border. Now, and they address it by hovering. Remember the hover selector? What this is saying is the second child, even though we haven't treated this, but just have an idea. It is simply saying the second child, the nth child, number 2. And the first one says give it a border of solid black. The second one says give it a border of dashed black. And the third one says give it a double black border, which is the one that was selected. Let's try an experiment and change this nth child 2 to 1. So this number 7 is the one that I selected because if you look at the specificity, it is 33, signifying there are 3 classes here and 3 elements, while the others are 24 and 23. That is, they have 2 classes, 4 elements, 2 classes, 3 elements, but this one has 3 classes and 3 elements, so it's more specific. Because all of them are competing for the same second child of the list item, the one that is most specific will win, which is number 7. If I decide to change this number 7 to target the first child, we are then left with number 5 and number 6 to target the second child. So CSS will choose which of them is more specific. So now, the first child is now double and the second one is solid black. So why do you think solid black was now chosen for the second one? That's because now that number 7 is targeting the first child, CSS is left with 5 and 6 to choose who is going to affect the second child. The first one is solid black, the second one is dashed black. Now, look at the specificity. The specificity of the first one is 2.4, while the second is 2.3. So CSS decides to go ahead with the one that is more specific, which is 2.4, solid black. Now, and of course, if you go below, you see the other selectors that apply padding, alignment, and font size. Don't worry, I'll share this code with you so that you play along with it. And we're going to treat more on this. So even if this looks a little bit, weird, just keep on learning. It will all tie together.